All right, so in this video, we're going to focus on things that are hopefully a little bit more positive than the last video. So we're going to talk a bit about prosocial behaviors, in particular, our tendency to help out another person when they're in trouble. So that's bystander intervention. We're also going to talk a bit about attractiveness, who we find attractive, and then also a little bit about love and who we tend to work well with in terms of a couple. And that's something that we talked about in the development chapter, but it also emerges here. So in this one, it is the maybe slightly more positive perspective in social psychology. Also happens to be a slightly shorter video. I don't know if that reveals something about the field or about me or human nature or what, but this is definitely a shorter video. Now, with prosocial behaviors, we're talking about times when we help out our fellow person. And so a little question to ponder is, let's say you're riding on a crowded subway car and you saw a man who fell down. Would you help that person? So that was a question that these particular researchers did. And if you think about it here, we might see the workings of in-group, out-group bias. We might see the workings of some just world belief. And what we see is that whether we tend to help that person, it doesn't seem to depend very much on their skin color. So if we look at this data, we see that regardless of whether the victim, the person who fell, is white or black, people were equally likely to help that person. However, what we see is maybe some role of the just world belief. So if the person was walking with a cane, people were very likely to help out that person. Probably because we were able to say, okay, this person is like me. They're just, some kind of external event. Those situational characteristics have caused them to be down on their luck, and this person fell. However, oh, my dog says hello. I don't know if you heard him in the background. If the person appears to be drunk and they fall down, we're much less likely to help that person, presumably because we believe that that person has done something to deserve their problem. There's probably also other reasons why we wouldn't help out. That definitely seems to play a role. All right, so getting a little bit more in depth with this issue of bystander intervention, I want to tell you a little bit of a story. And this has to do with my experience at that same park I was talking about before, where there was a fair amount of homelessness. And this was a park that was right near my house. I walked the dog there all the time. There were also a lot of families that were there. When the day was nice, just tons of people hanging out, reading, talking, walking their dogs. A very active park. Now, one day when I was there, I was standing with some other dog people, and we were talking. Beautiful day, lots of folks. And there was a woman who was dressed very scantily. She definitely looked like someone who was addicted to crack, looked like someone who was maybe prostituting herself. And she also looked drunk. And she was staggering around, kind of staggering from tree to tree. And then after about probably 2 or 3 minutes of staggering, she did collapse. All right, so here we have an issue similar to what I had on the last slide. Do we intervene? Did I? Did anybody else? Well, no. Me and probably another 25 people watched this woman and then watched as she fell down. And I hung out there for maybe about 7, 8 more minutes, grabbed my dog and went inside to go do something else. And in that time, nobody helped. So something I'd like for you to consider is not so much would you have helped, but why do you think other folks didn't? Why didn't I? I was a psychology professor at the time. I am aware of bystander intervention and the processes that go on. Why didn't I help? It's not something I'm particularly proud of. One of the things that has to go on in order for us to intervene is first we have to take note of the incident. Now, I could probably, chalk this up to, well, maybe a lot of people didn't step in and help because they just didn't notice her. And when we're in a crowded situation, people are less likely to help. And part of that's because when we are in a crowd, we're less likely to take note of what's going on. But I can't use that excuse. I saw her stumble, I saw her fall. Now, the second point is we have to decide if the incident is a problem. And this is probably where people made different interpretations. And if you think back to last week and these issues of conformity, there was most certainly some conformity. Everybody was looking to the other people to figure out what is the right way to act. And I think we all had a decision to make. Was this a problem? If she is drunk and maybe she has just passed out, she wants to maybe sleep it off, maybe she doesn't want to get the ambulance called because then she might get involved with the police, and so we're just going to let her be. But what if she's really, really drunk and this could be the last few breaths of her life? Or what if she's not drunk at all and she's just a diabetic? Her low blood sugar is what caused her to pass out. So there's a lot of different things that were going on in my mind and presumably other people's. Now, if we did decide it was a problem, then we have the challenge of how do we act and what do we do? And all these three things also get into the bystander intervention video that I'm asking you to watch, and it goes along with one of the discussion board questions. What should I have done? Let's say I made the decision that maybe this woman's drunk, maybe she's diabetic, but she's down and she has a problem. What do I do? Well, here we also have conformity. I don't really know what to do. I'm looking towards other people. Nobody else is acting. So I'm not sure what the correct course of action is. And this is something that I think in the video that people struggled with. How do we act? Now I want to compare that park scene to another scene that I had. Now, in the other case, I was by myself. It was a cloudy day in the wintertime. There weren't a lot of people. And in one incident, I was walking my dog around that same park, and there was a guy, and he came running down to me, and he said, "Help, my friend, he drank too much, he's passed out, he doesn't really seem to be breathing very well, can you help me?" Okay, now in this case, we have a couple things that are very different. First of all, his friend made sure that I noted that there was an incident. And I think one of the first things that we learn when we're taking CPR classes is if you are the one who comes on the scene, you are supposed to immediately point to another person and say, "You, call 911. You want to make sure that somebody else is noting that there's a problem. His friend did that. He also made it very clear that this isn't just something to be ignored. My friend is not breathing. Can you help me? This tells me that there's a problem. Now in this situation, again, we're dealing with a drunk person who's fallen down. But in this case, I was by myself. I couldn't look to other people. And I knew exactly how to act. I ran into my apartment right across the street, called 911. Within a few minutes, the ambulance was there helping the person. So I compare these two because the issue was very similar. We had somebody who probably drank too much who is now in trouble. But my behaviors were very different. One of the things was I was by myself. We do know that bystanders are more likely to intervene when they are by themselves than when they're in groups. The big thing is we're more likely to notice the problem, and we can't have diffusion of responsibility. Diffusion of responsibility is when we just assume somebody else will take care of it. This was also something that we touched on with social loafing. However, when I'm all by myself, I can't decide that it's somebody else's problem. I have to act. So definitely we see more intervention when the would-be helper is by him or herself. Now, there's some variations in terms of who tends to help. Certain folks are more likely to do it. And so you may, as you're watching the video or you're thinking about those examples that I just gave, maybe you are thinking, well, I would have definitely helped, or, oh, gee, I understand where she's coming from. I wouldn't have helped either. We do see that there's some variation on personality. We also see that men are more likely to help than women. That may be because they're stronger and they're less likely to fear for their safety. It might also be because men in our culture are socialized to be the ones who will step in and rescue. Now, we're also more likely to help if we've been previously reinforced for helping. If we've stepped in and we felt good, or maybe we were rewarded externally, we're more likely to continue with that pattern. Helping is more likely when we're in a good mood. And one of the ideas here is that when we are in a bad mood, we're very focused on our own safety and security. But when we're in a good mood, we're a lot more open. We tend to notice more things. We feel more safe. We're more creative. We're more flexible. And so we do tend to step in more often. Now, there are also some variations in who tends to receive our help. And this, we kind of get into some of the same phenomena that we talked about with the prejudice. Definitely some in-group, out-group issues. People who are similar to us. So if in that park example with the woman, if it had been somebody who looked like a college student, who was dressed like a college student, maybe she had a bag of books and she fell down, I feel very confident that I would have stepped in to help her. She's similar to me, also part of my in-group. Not surprisingly, if we like the people, we're more likely to help them. We're also more likely to help people who are attractive. And I'll talk just in a few minutes about all of the wonderful things that get granted to people who are physically attractive. Certainly people who don't appear to be responsible for what happened, going back to that slide with the difference between the man who had a cane versus the man who was drunk. And if the person provides some kind of justification for why they need some help. So when the guy came running down to me and said, "My friend passed out, I don't think he's breathing," that was a very clear justification for why he needed me to help him. I'm just going to scoot back up here real briefly about what type of person tends to help. There was a study that was done a little while ago that I think was very interesting. We might tend to think that certain people who are perhaps highly religious or who are in jobs where they are encouraged to help, and when they encourage other people to help. In particular, clergymen. We would expect that that is somebody who is very likely to step in. There was a study done a little while ago where guys who were in seminary, training to be pastors and ministers, were unwittingly involved in the study. And this was a bystander intervention work where there was a guy who had tripped and fallen, and he had tripped and fallen right in front of a doorway. And the doorway was essentially on the path that seminary students were going to have to take to get from the opening of the building to the classroom where they were going to get oral exams on. Actually, they were going to give a talk about the importance of helping your fellow man. Okay, so that is certainly a cornerstone in the teachings of most religions that are out there, certainly with Christianity. It was very much on these men's minds, and so we would expect these people would absolutely stop and help the man who had fallen down right in front of the doorway. But what actually was determined is that almost all of the guys, and they were in a hurry, they were running late, but almost all of the guys basically went right through the building, stepped over the person that had fallen to continue on to ironically give their speech on the importance of helping your fellow man. So even though there are certain people who are more likely to help, I think all of us are guilty of failing to act when probably we should. Now I'm switching gears a bit, and I had mentioned just a few minutes ago that people who are attractive are more likely to receive help. And I said at that point that when people are physically attractive, they tend to have a whole bunch of other positive things dumped on them as well. And you can see I have various things listed here. They all get to this idea that we tend to view people who are attractive as just generally being better people. It's what's known as the "what is beautiful is good" phenomenon. So physically attracted people are rated as being more intelligent, better able to do their job, more sociable, better parents, more moral. And we even reap these positive characteristics on attractive children. Unattractive children, when they misbehave, the blame is put much more on them personally, whereas when attractive children misbehave, it's just attributed to some type of situational variable. And I also thought this last point here about the prison sentences that are given to people seems to vary based upon their objective attractiveness. Probably one of the reasons why defense attorneys who are good will make a lot of effort to make sure that their clients are really cleaned up, they look good, they have a nice suit, because if the more attractive they look, the more lenient the judge is likely to be. Okay, now the issue of attractiveness certainly also comes into play when we are trying to find our ideal mate. And one of the things I really like to do when we are able to actually meet in class is to have a little bit of group discussion about what types of things we look for. We touched upon this a bit when we did the development chapter and we talked about marriage. When we think about what we want in a mate, and to a certain extent that seems to vary based upon whether you're a man or a woman, but what I have here on this list are the types of things that men and women together look for. A couple big things. One of them, not surprisingly, is we want somebody that likes us, a phenomenon that social psychologists refer to as reciprocity. I like you, you like me, and we just feel really good about that. It's also important that we have somebody who has proximity to us, meaning that they live close by. And that certainly makes a relationship much easier. I'll talk about that in just a minute. When somebody lives close by to us, we're also more likely to be familiar with them. So we tend to be attracted to people who are highly familiar. That's why we will often get into relationships and become married to people who went to school with us, who are in clubs or church with us, people who work with us, because they're just highly familiar. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. Another major issue is similarity. Now, there's this saying that opposites attract. And there's some truth to that and some falsehood to it. We tend to look for people who are similar to us in terms of attractiveness, something known as the matching hypothesis. We want to look for somebody who is as attractive as possible, but of course the most attractive folks tend to date the most attractive folks, and so it narrows the pool as we go down the attractiveness scale, and so we tend to sort and end up dating people who are comparable to us. And I think we all know that if we see a couple who's really mismatched on attractiveness, it's a little upsetting to us because the norm is that we do tend to match. Although this is changing, we also tend to match in terms of our race, our ethnicity, our religion, our social background, our educational background, the types of activities that our families do, our core family values. So a lot of these get to the fact that we want to be with people who are similar in terms of the core priorities that they have in their lives, the things that they put a really high level of importance on in terms of values. You can see that I have behavioral patterns up there, and I've in particular put up drinking habits. Drinking habits, how you like to socialize, and that's kind of fuzzy because certainly having similar desires in that regard is going to maybe cut down friction between you and your mate. But we also see that there are a lot of healthy relationships, healthy marriages, where people, each half of the couple like to spend their time in slightly different ways. And as long as we have that respect and that communication and that trust, those different types of behavioral habits don't seem to be a problem. Now, I emphasize that similarity in terms of values is what's really important. We can vary in terms of our behavioral patterns. We can also vary in terms of our personality characteristics. And in fact, there was a study that came out about 1.5 years ago showing that when people have exactly the same personality, there's actually more friction in the relationship than when they're slightly different. So it can be very helpful if you have somebody who's really organized being married to somebody who's less organized. Because when you have the person who's really organized, that ensures that the bills get paid, the house stays neat, deadlines are met. But the person who's less organized can help create a sense of a little bit more spontaneity and fun in the relationship. And again, as long as there's trust and respect and communication, those differences can be fine. So it's certainly not that we need to be identical with our mates. No, not at all. But we do really want to see those similar values. And maybe we can have differences in terms of personality, in terms of behavioral patterns, that kind of thing. Earlier I mentioned the importance of proximity and the fact that we tend to date and marry people who are just physically close to us. A big part of that is because it increases familiarity. It's also linked to similarity. So if me and my partner both grew up in Lancaster County, we grew up in a very close proximity to each other, well, the fact that we both grew up here is also probably going to shape our family values. It's going to shape some of our habits and our core priorities. So we're going to be similar in probably some really important ways. Another important thing that we really can't take for granted is that when somebody is physically close, it just makes them more available. It's very challenging to make a distance relationship work. And we do see that typically when we live a long distance from our mate, that relationship doesn't last. A final thing with proximity and familiarity is this issue of cognitive consistency. And that is, if I'm going to be seeing you a lot at work, at church, at school, if I see you a lot, I'm going to work to get along with you. I'm going to work to be nice to you. And of course, if I'm doing that, you're probably going to like me more because I'm being nice to you. So proximity seems to also not just breed familiarity, but also that reciprocity. If I like you, you like me. Familiarity I've also touched upon already. What we see is that the more that we come into contact with a person, we experience what's known as the mere exposure effect. This refers to the phenomenon that the more we're exposed to something, the more we tend to like it. This goes for songs, for example. Maybe the first time you heard a particular song, you felt neutral about it. But after hearing it 20 or 30 times, it really grew on you. And a very similar thing happens with people. As long as our original experience is at least neutral, familiarity is going to make me like somebody more. Now, if the very first time I saw them, I really did not like them, probably the more often I see them, I'm going to continue to dislike them. So this kind of violates one of the common themes of romantic comedies. Often with romantic comedies or soap operas, people initially hate each other, but then grow to love each other. That's not necessarily supported in the research. Why does it work? Well, the more often we're exposed to people, we tend to recognize them, and we're going to tend to like them. And we also assume that if somebody's really familiar to us, they're probably pretty similar. You're familiar to me because we're enrolled in the same school program, or we're going to the same church, or we're doing the same kind of job. That tells me that we're similar in some regard. So these issues of familiarity, similarity, proximity, reciprocity, they all basically are bundled together. I'm going to end on what is perhaps the most positive of the slides that I have, and that is just a brief discussion of love. Sternberg, the same guy who had the 3 different types of intelligences, also has these 3 different types of love. And he argues that any type of love that we experience is going to be comprised of at least one of these aspects. So the typology includes passion, intimacy, and commitment. Now he argues that consummate love, which of course is what any of us would hope to receive if we had a long-term romantic partnership, consummate love is going to involve all 3 of these things. So a good, strong marriage has passion. That's emotional passion. It's going to be physical passion. It's also going to have intimacy, which is that friendship and sense of connection and being understood. And the final thing that we see with consummate love is also that commitment. A commitment to one another, to be respectful, to communicate, to engage in shared decision making. The commitment to the relationship, the belief that each person places the relationship as being of a higher priority than individual needs. And so that's consummate love. But Sternberg also argued that there are a variety of other forms of love. So to start back up at the top, if you're in 7th grade, I know I certainly was saying how I loved this one guy in my class. Well, the reality was that was really just infatuation. And this can happen well into adulthood, really at any age. And with infatuation, all we have is that passion, that physical excitement, kind of the top of the roller coaster ride experience. But there really is no emotional connection and no commitment. Empty love, which perhaps maybe some grandparents, I would definitely say my grandparents fell into this category. They were committed to one another, but there really was no friendship, and there certainly was no physical connection. With romantic love, this might be the early stages of romantic relationships. There's the emotion and the physical connection. No real commitment yet. Now, when we get to companionate love, what we're talking about here is it could be a long-term romantic relationship that really doesn't involve much physical connection. But companionate love can also include family members. It could include really good friends, because there's a definite commitment there, as well as an emotional connection. And I would dare say that the love that we have for our pets would probably also come under this companionate love as well, because we feel an emotional connection with them. Maybe it's only one-sided, but we feel that emotion, and certainly we're committed to them. And then there are also, this is fairly rare, but there are also some romantic couples, or they might be long-term, quote, friends with benefits, where there's a definite physical passion. You're going to be committed to the person for a long time, but in terms of emotional connection, it's not really there. So where exactly we are, if you're in a long-term relationship, sometimes you might find yourself, initially in infatuation, and then in companionate and consummate love, and then maybe after a couple decades you find yourself in empty love. So that doesn't, of course, have to be, but I bring it up just to demonstrate that we have different forms of love, depending on who we're talking about, and that also throughout our relationships we might find ourselves in different forms of this love. All right, so I'll end there. That marks the end of the lecture for today. And don't forget, you do have a couple videos to watch, and then the discussion board. You need to post on one and then respond on the other. All right, thank you.